On December 19, 1827, a pirate ship carrying hundreds of enslaved Africans speeds through the choppy waters of the upper Florida Keys on its way to Havana, Cuba. Both the Americans and the British outlawed the slave trade some 20 years prior, so the ship, which has gone by many names and now sails under the banner the Guerrero, hopes to avoid detection by the boats patrolling offshore. Today, the Guerrero's captain presses his crew onward into the midwinter afternoon to avoid the worst of a coming squall. A British naval schooner named the HMS Nimble spots the Guerrero and makes its approach. The Nimble fires 2 warning shots, a signal to the pirate ship that it must stop for inspection. Instead, the Guerrero's captain orders his crew to take flight. The aptly named Nimble chases the Guerrero for 5 hours before it catches up to the much larger and more heavily armed brig. Shots ring out from the deck. The 2 ships trade gunfire until the Guerrero's sails are tattered. Still, the pirates try to make their escape, knowing what awaits them if they get captured. Suddenly, the Guerrero crashes into a shallow reef at a speed of 10 knots, razor-sharp coral ripping into the ship's hull and irreparably toppling its masts. The Nimble, not far behind, suffers from the same fate. The ocean slowly swallows the Guerrero as its occupants, both crew and human cargo, float amidst the debris, praying for rescue. Although the exact location of the Guerrero remains unknown to this day, we do know that 41 of the 561 captive Africans in the hull died that night, their names and stories lost to the sea. Welcome to Tomorrow is the Problem, a podcast from ICA Miami's Art and Research Center, where we approach urgent issues of our time by unearthing the hidden meanings behind everyday phenomena and ask how they might help us build a more liberated future. I'm your host, Donna Honarpiche, and this season, our first season, we are looking at the ocean as a source of knowledge. Yes, the ocean is a physical space, but it also carries symbolic and historical meaning across many cultures and communities. For communities whose lives are dependent on the sea, or for whom the sea carries a history of violence, like slavery or colonialism, the sea is also an important means for understanding their identity and history. In the words of the Nobel Prize-winning poet and playwright Derek Walcott,
"The sea is history. Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history."
What Walcott is saying here is that memories and stories that are not adequately represented by historical narratives or records, like the enslaved Africans who died when the Guerrero sank, have been purposely left at the bottom of the ocean, not just violently repressed by dominant historical narratives, but submerged, where no one can see them or honor them or be held accountable to them. In today's episode, we'll unearth those wrecks, the stories they contain, and we'll look towards the sea as a site for healing. Dr. Ayana Omilade Flewellen is an archaeologist, storyteller, an artist, and a scholar. They currently teach at the University of California, Riverside, and they are a member of the board of Diving with a Purpose, a nonprofit founded in 2003 to specifically explore and document the wrecks in Biscayne Park, including the long-lost Guerrero. We asked Ayana what drives them and the other members of Diving with a Purpose to search for these ships.
So when you think about the transatlantic slave trade, more broadly, right? So you're thinking about like an enterprise from like the 16th through the 19th century. And if you can imagine it, like the magnitude of it, right? So 12.5 million Africans were forced to make this voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. And out of that 12.5 million, you have about 1.8 million that were actually lost at sea. The numbers themselves are so massive.
According to the Slave Voyages Database, a digital initiative that compiles records of origins and forced relocations of enslaved Africans throughout history, about 12,000 ships made 36,000 voyages during the transatlantic slave trade.
And there are 1,000 of them. 1,000 of those ships have gone missing, right? Only around less than 10 have ever been recovered. So you have 1.8 million Africans that have perished during this crossing. You have 1,000 missing ships. And that's the kind of history that the oceans hold. This history of that voyage itself, of that enterprise, of that loss. So the Guerrero itself is part of that monumental story about how this enterprise shifted and changed the entire world.
But the most incredible thing about diving with a purpose is its members.
DWP has trained over 500 divers to do survey work in partnership with the National Park Service as well as with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. We've surveyed 18 shipwrecks and logged over 18,000 volunteer hours. And participants who go through the program with DWP get a PADI certification card in maritime archaeological survey and really become advocates for this work and advocates for the protection and preservation of this history that's right in the waters surrounding us.
Ayana also co-founded the Society for Black Archaeologists alongside our next guest, Dr. Justin Dunnavant.
And we really founded SBA to be a networking space for archaeologists of African descent, primarily because we would go to archaeological conferences like the Society for Historical Archaeology or the SAAs, for instance. You could count the number of Black archaeologists on two hands. The interesting sort of take on that is that while there are so few Black archaeologists, the actual interest in African and African diasporic history within archaeology is very expansive.
Ayana's co-founder is also on the vanguard of this new field of underwater archaeology.
My name is Dr. Justin Dunnavant, and really my life's work over the last decade or so has been trying to uncover the history of the African diaspora and various experiences that often aren't recorded in the written record, but come up in the material record.
By the material record, Justin means the physical traces people leave behind, both on land and underwater. In addition to co-founding the Society for Black Archaeologists with Ayana, Justin is also a professor of archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Justin and his team research, locate, and visit wrecked ships to uncover histories that can't be found anywhere else on Earth.
Traditionally, anthropology and archaeology has been a terrestrial process. We've been focusing mostly on landscapes, mostly on people who lived and operated on land. And underwater archaeology is fairly new, really developing in the last 50 years or so. And a lot of it has been to do with issues with technology. We just didn't have the technology to do a lot of that work historically. And then it's very cost prohibitive because you have to get a boat, you've got to get the gear, you've got to be able to go out consistently. And a lot of these things weren't readily known or available.
Barriers like technology, access, and costs mean that oftentimes military wrecks are prioritized over vessels like slave ships. Even the Titanic, the most famous shipwreck of all time, was only discovered as an afterthought on the tail end of a mission to find a sunken naval ship.
At the same time, what we don't understand is that the Titanic was a part of the White Star Line shipping company. And in the early 1900s, a man by the name of Marcus Garvey created the Black Star Line shipping company with an attempt to create a Black-owned shipping company that would rival what was then the largest white-owned shipping company.
Marcus Garvey was one of the most prominent Black separatists and Pan-Africanists of the early 20th century. He is most famous for founding the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Here's a rare clip of Garvey, recorded in 1921.
As you are aware, the world in which we live today is divided into separate race groups and distinct nationalities. Each race and each nationality is endeavoring to work out its own destiny to the exclusion of other races and other nationalities. We hear the cry of England for the Englishman, of France for the Frenchman, of Germany.
To achieve economic emancipation from white-dominated society, Garvey founded several companies, including the Negro Factories Corporation and Negro World Newspaper, and as Justin was saying, the Black Star Line Shipping Company.
And he had 4 ships that were going throughout the Caribbean, as well as attempting to then bring people back from the Americas to Africa. 2 of his 4 ships have sank, and nobody has looked for those yet. So my next project is actually going to be attempting to go and look for those ships and to tell that story and to reinvigorate that narrative, because then we can begin to explore other elements of Black history that aren't necessarily tied to these discussions of slavery and social death and all of the ways that we've generally been describing our relationship to the ocean in relation to the transatlantic voyage, but actually looking at it as a sign of, well, we have had our own shipping companies. We've had other types of engagements with the ocean that aren't necessarily negative. And there's a whole history that we have left to explore there.
The rules of archaeology are different underwater. Sometimes this means preservation looks different at sea, becoming less about extracting and displaying in a museum than it is about preserving the conditions that allow for certain elements or artifacts to remain untampered by human intervention. And because the field is so new, there is more room for debate about how we are meant to interact with objects of history, or if we're meant to interact with them at all.
There are some marine environments that have been able to preserve shipwrecks and plane wrecks and other types of artifacts and sites very well. In many cases, because the environmental conditions aren't very disruptive, or some sort of algae or bacteria grows that actually protects these elements. But as soon as we take it out of that environment, it could deteriorate rapidly. So it's meant that in some cases, preservation has actually meant just leaving a site alone and making sure that it's not known.
This sensibility sits in direct contradiction to the predominant Western colonial viewpoint that archaeology should involve an excavation of artifacts and physical remains, uncovering and exploring everything that might be hidden. As a result, Justin's work squares the very material ways in which the sea is history, along with a profoundly intellectual excavation of the ideas that underpin anthropology and archaeology. Because, Justin says, there's another more nuanced reason some sites are best left untouched.
As the field of archaeology is becoming more and more diverse, and as we get different perspectives coming into this field, we're learning that different people's understandings of what is considered history and heritage and what ancestral sites are, what they mean, how they're supposed to be used and engaged with, how artifacts, or as we're calling them, belongings, are engaged with and preserved and conserved, all have to be rethought in unique ways depending on whose cultures and environments you're working in, and also who it is that is engaging in this work. As a result of that, we come to an understanding that there are certain sites that don't necessarily need to be explored or studied or excavated, in part because actually uncovering them would damage the integrity of what they're meant to do. There are certain things that are buried for ritualistic practices that are meant to stay buried. There are certain things that are built to be used, and they have spirit and they have value in their use, and therefore they're not meant to sit on a shelf in a museum. And recognizing those and understanding that is the sort of important work that more of us have to do in this field of heritage studies. We also realize that there are knowledges that we may not know or be able to access. And there are knowledge keepers in communities that are directly tied to some of these sites. And when you remove a knowledge keeper from a site, you also remove the integrity of the site.
I think what you're saying is incredibly beautiful, and it also allows us to approach the sea as a space that's not necessarily human-centered. And there's a kind of humility around what you're talking about, where we don't have to know everything, and there are certain elements that will remain unknown to us at sea.
Yeah, I think there's this assumption that everything has to be known and explored. And I think it really develops out of this Western notion of science that everything needs to be categorized, cataloged, named, and somehow understood or contained. And there's so much that is possible when we don't try to do those things. I think there's a huge movement now going on in academia where everybody's trying to undo everything in terms of norms. Everything's from gender norms to norms around identity and what can and cannot be, and exploring these different elements of sort of flexibility or fluidity. I think the ocean and the sea is a very unique and important place for us to study that concept fully, because it is something that has never been able to be fully commodified or grasped. There's been land grabs all over the world where different colonial powers are occupying land and claiming land, and somebody can own land. But we are in 2022 now, and the idea that somebody would own the ocean is still a very foreign concept. People, of course, claim certain rights, a certain amount of distance off of coasts. But the idea that there is a colonial government that owns the Indian Ocean, for example, is something that would not sit well with most people, because it's a sort of foreign concept. At the same time, that means that we have to think about what are the possibilities in a space that can never be fully owned. And what does it look like, not just on the surface of the ocean, but also as we go deeper and deeper into the bottom of the ocean.
With this in mind, Justin and his colleagues introduce a radical spirituality to their archaeological practice that not only respects the powerful force of the ocean, but honors the heritage and cultural importance of the wrecks that they decide to uncover.
I think doing this work archaeologically and historically is a very spiritual practice in and of itself. We are individuals who, for better or for worse, and whether we do it intentionally or unintentionally, are tasked with recovering memory and bringing it back into popular use, discourse, and belief. And doing that requires us to take very close attention and care for how it's used and how it can be used. And also realizing that we are becoming stewards of maintaining a historical knowledge that may not have fully been known before, or in some cases may not be fully known in the future.
Justin shared with us that when he and his team do an excavation on land at African diaspora sites, they pour libations before they start, as a sign of respect, and as Justin puts it,
what needs to be revealed will be revealed, and ensuring that anything that is uneasy is at ease, and facilitating that transition is important. And I think that that's something that just we've continued to do historically. When we think about it underwater, and especially dealing with this topic of the transatlantic slave trade, it becomes even more important when they located the Chazozé shipwreck off the coast of South Africa, where a number of enslaved Africans actually perished on this ship coming from Mozambique on its way to Brazil. And in interacting with people in that community today, they said, we can't bring those people back here, but you can bring our homeland to them. And so they took soil back and poured it as an offering and libation over the wrecking site. So it's a deeply moving experience. And it also, again, it facilitates this process of how it is that we engage with history. Going through that process is an experience that no matter what you felt before or what you think you might know, you're not going to have an issue remembering that history and that story.
So if some objects of belonging aren't meant to be brought to the surface, how does Justin think we should honor these sites and relate to these underwater histories?
For me specifically, I've been thinking about a museum that would commemorate the transatlantic slave trade. But I think the elements of taking care to have an ethical consideration of those individuals who perished in the slave trade would be a significant portion of that. And in that way, I think it would have to have some element of healing, and then also trying to counter the narratives of Black Death by showing what life looks like underwater would be significant. So one thing that I've been thinking about with others is this idea of having a sort of living coral garden as a site of commemoration. Just as people have gardens on land as memorial sites, we could think about what it means to develop and nurture one underwater, where the participants of the museum could actually help to outplant coral in an annual event or a monthly event in a way that also restores these environments that have been negatively impacted by the slave trade.
We were so taken with the idea of an underwater monument and the healing it could inspire that we wanted to know, what would Justin's living coral garden look like in reality?
I'm a fourth-year Ph.D. candidate at the Coral Reef Futures Lab under Dr. Andrew Baker at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. Bit of a mouthful.
Kelsey specializes in something called coral migration.
And so my work specifically focuses on assisted migration, which is essentially taking corals from environments that are currently or soon will not be habitable due to things like climate change, and moving them to areas that are, again, now or in the future going to be habitable, where they're going to be able to survive and persist under the pressures of climate change.
And in addition to her work at the Coral Reef Futures Lab, Kelsey was a dive master in the Florida Keys, the same Florida Keys whose coral reefs sank the Guerrero.
A coral reef is just a rainbow. I think that's what draws people in a lot of the time, is because it does have just like such a wide swath of color palette. I mean, you can see anything from pinks to browns to greens to oranges. There's just a really wide variety and color spectrum of Florida's coral reefs. And you realize that you have entered an alien world. You have entered a place that only about 1% of people in the world will ever see. And that is a great privilege, and that is a great responsibility for sure. You do feel protective of this ocean environment, and you come to realize that it does deserve our protection. It does deserve our stewardship, which is, I think, the great disconnect between people and coral reefs, is that you do have, when people look out on the ocean, all that they see is a 2D environment. All that they see is the flatness of the water. But if they could only take a step deeper and just see what goes on underneath, I mean, I think that it would just really change people's hearts.
Ayana, Justin, and Kelsey are bringing to the surface what the sea is hiding below. With her scientific background and deep knowledge of coral reefs, Kelsey elaborated on Justin and Ayana's vision.
So we would essentially be engineering coral reefs, which is definitely something that my lab is looking into, is creating coral reefs where there weren't any before. So creating these novel environments. And I definitely think a place where people have access to these coral reefs, where they can go visit them, and more importantly, where they can see what a healthy coral reef looks like. Because off of the coast of Florida and the coast of Miami, you would be hard-pressed to find a healthy coral reef and all of the fish and all of the organisms that come along with that.
When I think about the relationship between environmental conservation efforts and cultural preservation efforts, they so beautifully converge around the recovery of these shipwrecks.
Ayana envisioned for us what their ideal of an underwater museum would look like if the Guerrero's final resting place is ever revealed to the material record.
I think oftentimes when we think about like finding ships underwater, we imagine that we would come across these like whole vessels that we could sort of like swim in and out of. And unfortunately, because of the material that these vessels were made out of, the wood itself, like it's oftentimes just the sort of fragments of it that are then pieced together, and the sort of metal fixings that would have held together sails and pulleys are what we recover, cannonballs, things like that. So I think we would have to be really creative around how we imagined what a monument, if it was a particular wreck site or a monument to the transatlantic slave trade underwater more widely or broadly can look like. That allows people, I think, to really pause in a space. Like, what would it look like to create spaces where we actually breathe underwater, like and facilitate a kind of actual sort of meditation around that? I think would be absolutely fantastic. There's this beautiful project around African burial grounds that are being transformed into these sort of garden spaces that they then become spaces that people regularly tend to. So thinking about what that can look like underwater. But I think the most important part of it is like tending to the sort of history of these spaces that doesn't create the spectacle of Black death, but facilitates the kind of healing necessary for people when they're confronted with these spaces.
They also spoke to the importance of the somatic experience of divers, or even people looking to care for and pay homage to wrecks like the Guerrero.
When I think about like the potentiality of the Guerrero project or the search for the Guerrero and the impact it has on Black history making, I think not only about the vessel itself, but what it means to have Black divers really committed to recovering its story. When we're thinking about these vessels, and oftentimes, especially with the vessels that have wrecked, they often had enslaved Africans that perished in these accidents as well. And in that way, the history of the Atlantic Ocean oftentimes becomes this history of Black death. And what it means to have Black divers actually attempting to recover this history, doing the work of actually breathing underwater to do this work, like to actually intimately be in their bodies, recovering this history, all of that really speaks to this desirability to have the Atlantic also be this space of Black life that I think is really, really deeply important. And I think in addition to that, stories like the Guerrero make these very real, tangible connections from history in the past itself to the present, which is what I think is needed and necessary in this moment. Like, we need to have histories that are alive and that resonate today so that people can really, like, the affect of them, right? So they could feel them, you know? Like, I think that the Guerrero project and this work has that potential, is doing that. And you can hear it when you hear people talking about the project itself, the kind of emotional pull that it takes to share about it, what it means for divers to be in the water as well, what it meant for me, for Justin, to actually be diving in the Atlantic, in these spaces that hold these histories. All of that, you know, is really around the sort of embodied aliveness of this history that really requires us to really sort of resonate in the knowing that the past is very much alive right now and resonant right now.
Counter to the familiar narratives of Black death that saturate our understanding of the transatlantic, Ayana and Justin draw our attention to the embodied experience of diving, amplifying the experience of Black breath underwater.
For Black people, for Black women more specifically, to be breathing underwater, to be breathing in the Atlantic within itself, the imagery of it, documenting it, capturing that is a counter archive to the one that we're presented with that only gives us the Atlantic as a space of Black death, where Black people are not breathing. So the kind of work that we're doing around somatic monumentality, the kind of work that we do prior to diving, centers on the breath and the potential of Black breath to be the kind of space of generational healing necessary as we confront these histories.
We wanted to explore somatic monumentality further. Is it possible that the histories they referenced are more present than we thought? What would it mean for the breath of an entire underwater world built by the children of enslaved women to bubble beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean? In our next episode, we explore just that, an underwater world created by Drexciya, a Detroit-based electronic music duo, and the legacy it's forged for the future. What is the one thing that you think that everyone should know about Drexciya?
The one thing they should know is that Drexciya is the greatest electro group of all time. That's the one thing they should know.
Tomorrow is the Problem is produced in partnership with Podfly Productions. This episode was produced and written by Isabel Lee and me, Donna Honarpische, and edited by Francis Harlow. Our showrunner is Jocelyn Aram. Nina Pollock is our sound designer and mixing engineer. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Ayana Omilade Flewellen, Dr. Justin Dunnavant, and Kelsey Sapp Johnson. And thank you to the Folger Shakespeare Library and Reblack for the archival audio of Derek Walcott and Marcus Garvey. And thank you as well to Bruno Hunger and Gregor Huber for letting us use their song Junk as our theme. I'm Donna Honarpiche. Thanks for listening.